Angus really doesn't need much introduction. He's been here before. He's a member of the society. He's an avid historian specialising in Japan. And I think most of us would be very interesting to understand why the Japanese carrier strike forces failed towards the end of the war. And again, we're just talking about planning. When they had all that technology and brain power, why did they fail? So, Angus, thanks, and looking forward to hearing from you. Angus, over to you.
Thank you, David, and good morning, everybody. Yes, today's presentation is about the quite astonishing collapse of Japanese carrier power and naval aviation in the year 1944. And it really was a spectacular disaster, which I don't think has any other parallel. Certainly it did not, the Royal Navy and the United States Navy were never engulfed with such a catastrophe. So to commence this, let us go back to 1st of January 1942. The first air fleet, Kido Butai, on the 1st of January 1942 was comprised of 6 first-line fleet carriers, 4 of which were designed under the various treaty regimes, they being Treaty of Washington and the subsequent London treaties in the 1930s. Now, the first 2 of these, the Akagi and the Kaga, which you can see here, were converted under the terms of the Washington Treaty from existing capital ships, which were incomplete. You might be able to notice that they set a trend in Japanese carriers where the Akagi's bridge was on the port hand side and the Kaga's bridge was on the starboard side. And the reason or the rationale for this was Japanese believed that by having bridges on alternate sides of the carriers, they could do joint landings and make landings and takeoffs more efficient. Unfortunately, in the long run, this didn't work so well. There were a number of, especially training fatalities with this system, and it was eventually discarded. The next class, we can see the first representative as the 3rd carrier, the Unryu-class, came into service under what was known as the 2nd Naval Armament Supplement Plan in 1934. It's otherwise known as the Circle 2 Plan. And these 2 ships, again, had opposite side bridges, and they were constructed under the tonnage limits, the tonnage allocation under the London Treaty of 1930. And you can see they're around about 17,300, so they were basically designed to fill the remaining space. The 3rd pair, the Shokaku class, were post London treaties, Japan having withdrawn from the treaty regime in 1935 and 1936. And they were ordered under the 3rd Naval Armaments Supplement Plan, 1937, the Circle 3 Plan. And it was with the Shokakus that the alternate bridge placements was ended. And these 2 ships were widely regarded as the best aircraft carriers in the world until the introduction of the Essex-class American carriers in 1943. Now, backing up the 6 main carriers, Japan also possessed 4 light carriers. The first of these was the Hosho, which was the first operational aircraft carrier in the world, commissioned in 1922, and the first carrier in the world commissioned as such, so it wasn't a conversion. Whereas Unryu, down at the bottom of the page, was actually a treaty carrier. It was commissioned in 1933. Under the Washington Treaty, light carriers or ships with flat tops under the displacement of 8,000 tons were not classified as aircraft carriers. So Unryu was built, supposedly complied with the 8,000 ton limit, and so the Japanese very cleverly exploited the loophole because the end tonnage, as you can see, was somewhat over 10,000 tons. The remaining 2 light carriers, the Shoho class carriers, were actually quite ingenious. Both were designed from the Shoho and the Zuio were designed from the outset as submarine tenders. However, the design incorporated features which allowed their rapid conversion as either oilers or light carriers, which occurred in 1941 and very early 1942 when they were converted. And this was a trait that we will see shortly in the situation as it existed in January 1944. Now, if we turn to the events in the 2-year space between 42 and 44, this is an overview of the losses suffered. And as we can see, red for fleet carriers, green light carriers with Japan, and blue fleet carriers, purple light carriers for the United States. The score was 7-6. And if we break this down, actually the Japanese were, with the exception of Midway, had a certain amount of superiority in what was essentially a war of attrition between these dates. The Japanese losses were sustained in 4 engagements, of which 4 were sustained in 1 engagement. So taking away the 4 fleet carriers lost at Midway, their losses amounted to 2 light carriers, and the Chuyo, which I've put in khaki, was an escort carrier, which we'll come to shortly. Whereas the Americans also had lost 4 fleet carriers and 2 light carriers, but the difference being is that aside from Midway, the Americans suffered far heavier casualties in relation to the Japanese, and they suffered them more consistently, because whereas the Japanese losses were sustained in 4 engagements, the American losses were sustained across 6 engagements. So in the vast majority of the engagements as listed, an American carrier was essentially lost in each of these engagements. And at the end of 1942, the American carrier force had basically been whittled down to USS Enterprise and the light carrier Long Island, and that was about it, whereas Japan still held the theoretical advantage. However, things were to change by the time we reach January 1944. In 1944, at the 1st of January, let's have a look at the size of the Japanese fleet carriers force as it was then. In service, we have the Shokaku and the Zuyaku, which are still going. Pre-commission stage, we have the Taiho class, the first and only representative of the Taiho class, an improved Shokaku with, as can be seen, a elevated funnel on a 26-degree angle to avoid smoke over the flight deck, and an enclosed bow, which was very similar to the British Illustrious class and the Ark Royal. Now, it was constructed under the Circle 4 plan in 1939. Also under construction at the time, but manifestly incomplete, were the Unryu-class. These were enlarged versions of the Sorus. They were constructed under the revised Circle 5 plan in 1942, my apologies. And this Circle 5 plan was revised and revised and revised again. And in the process, 16 Unryu-class carriers were originally ordered. The majority of these were cancelled, along with the Ikoma class, which was basically a slightly enlarged Unryu. And 3 of the Unryus were cancelled for the purposes of converting the last of the major ships, which was the Shinano. And the Shinano was constructed under the Circle 4 plan as the 3rd of the Yamato-class battleships. However, following the defeat at Midway, a rapid conversion to aircraft, an aircraft carrier was undertaken, and she shall occupy some period of our story later on. The light carrier force at this time still included the Zuiho and the Hosho, even though Hosho was basically a training carrier. The 4 additions, I should say, the major additions, were the Hyo class. Now, these ships, as you can see bottom right, Hyo, were essentially built under the same system as related to the Zuio and the Shoho. That is, they were built this time as luxury liners, fast cruise ships. But in the construction, the Japanese Navy contributed a very hefty subsidy. And they were designed in a way that they could be converted extremely quickly into carriers with strengthened bulkheads for the elevators and the flight decks, and a number of other innovations, which meant their conversion could be relatively quick. And these were converted both in the early stages of the war, and both saw quite extensive action during 1942. These were followed by the Totose class, which, following the same formula, were built as seaplane carriers. They saw extensive service as seaplane carriers, including the initial attacks in the Netherlands East Indies, before they too underwent conversions in the wake of Midway as a second line of light carriers. The last of these ships was probably the most unfortunate in a way, because it was kept out of frontline service wherever possible because of some serious flaws in its construction. This was the Ryuho. She was a sub-chaser, and again, a targeted conversion, converted on 20 November 1942. And she turned out to be, well, basically a fairly ordinary ship. She wasn't as fast as the other ones, and she had limits. Even though she could carry 36 aircraft, she had limits with the amount she could put on the flight deck at any one time. We move now to a third variety, and this is the escort carriers, all of which were converted from two classes of liners, again under the same system. And these were designated to be escort carriers. As we can see from their specifications, they were far too slow to accompany the fleet in first line operational service. And so they would escort convoys and also provide the very important role of ferrying aircraft, which given the outlying nature of many of the Japanese garrisons and defences in the Pacific, was an extremely important task to make sure that they were ready for any eventualities. Now, the first great test of carrier power in 1944 came with the Battle of the Philippine Sea. And the Battle of the Philippine Sea was, and remains to this date, the largest carrier engagement in history, carrier v carrier. We have a look at the opposing forces. The Japanese could field 9, of which 3 were fleet carriers. Americans, on the other hand, could put in 7 fleet carriers and 8 light carriers. So essentially the advantage was a quite considerable 15 to 9. And it's noteworthy that all of the American, or virtually all of the American carriers named there, with the exception of the Enterprise, were all commissioned subsequent to January 1943. So essentially what we are looking at here is the emergence of a brand new American fleet, as envisaged under the Vincent plans in 1938, and which was emerged in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. So essentially it was a brand new American fighting force, almost completely replacing, with the exception of the Saratoga and the Enterprise, the carriers from the early period. Now, turning to the battle itself, and I won't go into overly great detail about it, the battle itself was fought, as you can see, to the west of the Marianas Islands. A caution should be taken in looking at this map. It is not truly representational. You can see the yellow star in the middle. That simply represents the points from where the airstrikes were launched. That was not the actual point of contact between the two fleets. As you can see, the Japanese, with the red, launched their strikes first against the American carriers, which were just situated off Guam. And the following day, the United States Task Force 58 carriers launched their attacks at the retreating Japanese, who were retiring towards Okinawa. having originally come from the Philippines. Now, the reason for that was their main supplies of oil at this point were located in Borneo and Sumatra, and not in Japan itself. So basically the Japanese mobile fleet, as it was now known under Admiral Ozawa, was very much dependent on basing in the Dutch East Indies rather than in the Pacific itself, so it could be next to its oil supplies. Now, the first day of what was to be a two-day battle was a rather disastrous one for the Japanese, particularly in the air, as we will come to later. However, as far as carrier losses go, it was catastrophic. And the details here contain of the sinking of the Taiho and the Shokaku point to two general causes. The first, both of them were torpedoed by American submarines, which had torpedoes free of defects. If they had been using the same torpedoes they had prior to mid-1943, both carriers would have likely survived. As it was, with the torpedo hits exposed the single biggest danger, as we will come to see with Japanese carriers, and that was the protection of their avgas and fuel systems, specifically providing some form of shock-resistant material in the form of a cofferdam or otherwise to prevent the shock waves from torpedoes or bombs from rupturing the tanks and their associated piping and pumping apparatus, and preventing the ships from, in effect, turning into a very large fuel-air bomb. And this is precisely what happened. Both of the ships, having suffered the hits, Shokaku shortly thereafter, and Taiho sometime thereafter, basically exploded. And part of the problem in Taiho's case was the damage control measures the crew took immediately after the first torpedo strike. These crew were relatively inexperienced. They had no combat experience, the majority of them. The damage control officer determined, instead of trying to confine the spread of fuel vapor to the forward elevator, to instead engage the ship's entire ventilation system to try and flush the fumes out. This unfortunately didn't work. Instead, it succeeded in pumping the dissolved avgas into every corner of the ship. And inevitably, some hours later, there was a trip relay or a spark, and you can imagine what happened next. As you can see from the casualty counts, they were extraordinarily high, particularly on the Taiho, this being the effect of the explosions. Now, as there is no photography known of the end of either of these two carriers, to get some idea what they would have gone through, we turn to some American examples. Earlier in the piece, the USS Lexington and the USS Wasp. And you can see from that, these photos are taken at the point of detonation, what just the colossal effects of damage that such detonations could do. And having a look at these, both of which sank fairly soon after these explosions occurred, you can get a fair idea of just how quickly these two carriers were sunk once the fires took hold and reached the avgas compartments. Now, the following day, the Americans attempted to intercept the fleeing Japanese force. They weren't able to do this because of late sightings, and so the strike went in approximately 4:30 to 5:30 in the afternoon, very close to dusk. The attacks were judged as not particularly successful, mainly because the American command did not know of the sinking yet of the sinking of the Taiho and the Shokaku. In this attack, the Zuaku took extremely heavy damage but survived yet again. But it was the Hio that took the brunt of the damage. She was hit by bombs and torpedoes. Again, efforts were made to fight the fires. but the terror of the internal explosion came back to haunt her when her avgas tanks eventually exploded as well. Although the casualties in this instance were relatively light, she had managed to evacuate the majority of her crew before the ship sank. Things were just to get worse for the Japanese. 14th of August, the Taiho, similar scenario, torpedoed near Luzon, another avgas explosion, 360 lives lost. Following month was the Unryu-class turn. Now, this time there was no explosion involved. She was actually steaming between Singapore and Hong Kong, transport duties, and she was struck by a single torpedo in the middle of a storm. Now, the crew were able to keep the ship afloat for quite some considerable time, but eventually the effects of the storm and the torpedo proved too much, and she basically snapped in half and sank with, as you can see again, a terrible loss of life. The last stand for the Kido Butai as a force came at the Battle of Cape Edgano on the 25th and 25th of October 1944. And this actually was the use of the Kido Butai as a decoy force. And as we can see here, the Northern force, again under Vice Admiral Ozawa, with Zukaku, Zuiho, Chitos, and Shoyoda. The Third Fleet, and I should say, in mentioning the Third Fleet, that the Third Fleet and the Fifth Fleet designation was the same force. It just depended which admiral was commanding, and they commanded on a rotational basis. So whereas Spruance had commanded at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, it was Halsey's turn at Lady Gulf, and that is why it is designated the Third Fleet. And on this occasion, the balance of carriers was 3, 6, 9, 10, 11 to 4. So it was slightly closer. However, this was offset by the complete disparity in the air groups fielded by each force. Now, the Battle of Leyte itself, as you can see from the map, was actually 4 engagements in one over a period of several days. And the one we are interested in is at the top right of the screen, number 3. As I explained, Ozawa's role was to come in and decoy Halsey's fleet, namely the large carrier elements of the fleet and the fast battleships, away from the area of Leyte. So the central force, which you will find next to the number 1 under Admiral Kurita, could come through from the north, and the southern force, which is down in the bottom left-hand corner under Admiral Nishimura, could form a pincer from the south, and both of those surface forces would fall upon the invasion shipping and destroy it. Now, Ozawa's part of the operation was brilliantly executed, absolutely brilliantly executed. Halsey fell for the ruse, hook, line, and sinker. And as soon as his reconnaissance aircraft had discovered the arrival of the Northern force on the scene or its approach, the Third Fleet was promptly turned around to the northeast and galloped after it. Now, part of this, as I said, was a subterfuge because the vast majority of Ozawa's aircraft had been redeployed to either Luzon or Formosa following the Battle of the Philippine Sea. And aboard his 3 carriers, he had 4 carriers, I apologize. He had approximately 50 strike aircraft and around about 60 fighters. And the aircraft, the American aircraft, were launched on attack. The Japanese aircraft, I apologize, were launched on attacks, which we will come to, which we will deal with now. They were basically all shot down in a single raid against Halsey's fleet. Halsey retaliated the next morning, and it was on the 25th of October 44 that the coup de grace was essentially imposed on the Japanese carrier force. The air attacks commenced at 8 o'clock in the morning, lasted most of the day. The first victim was the Shitose, went down just after 9:30 after being smothered with bombs and torpedoes. Then there was some period of respite before the Zuikaku went down next at 14 hours. She had taken incredible punishment, as you can see, 7 torpedoes and 9 bombs. That was more than most Japanese required by most Japanese carriers to sink. She was then followed by the Zuio, the veteran light carrier, 1526, and she proved particularly elusive and difficult to track down. And the last of the ships targeted was the Chiyoda. Chiyoda was bombed, and then at just before 5 o'clock, she was targeted by American cruisers and battleships which had reached the vicinity, placed under bombardment, and all hands were lost. And as one can see again from these, the casualty figures were extremely high. Now, these two photos here portray both the veterans just before they were sunk. And I think the one on the left is particularly poignant because if one considers for a moment that the vast majority of crewmen saluting the flag before the Zuio capsized were not to survive. The carnage, however, was not over. Next up was a ship we haven't heard of before, the Akitsu Maru. In fact, I'm sure many people have not heard of the Akitsu Maru because she wasn't actually a ship belonging to the Imperial Japanese Navy. She instead belonged, along with a number of other amphibious support ships, to the Japanese Army. And she was quite an interesting vessel in her own right, because apart from carrying light observation planes, or up to 30 aircraft acting as an aircraft ferry, she also carried a squadron of gyrocopters. And these proved to be extremely useful when it came to the anti-submarine role, because they were able to get them up very quickly. They were armed with light depth charges and bombs, and it was actually a new dimension. It was really, in a way, if you look at it, the first use of helicopters or the proto-helicopter in the anti-submarine role. And that was quite significant, that it was the Imperial Japanese Army that used these systems and not the Imperial Japanese Navy. Now, in this instance, the Akitsu Maru, it wasn't the fuel this time, it was the depth charges that she was carrying as cargo. We can see again a depth toll quite significantly over that of the Titanic. And this was just the sad reality of a life on board Japanese carriers at this time of the war. It was basically, if they were hit by torpedoes, it was a very good idea to get off quickly because they would inevitably explode for one reason or another. Now we come to the Shinyo. Same old story. Except this time it was in the East China Sea, and we can see as we progress that the locations for these sinkings are basically most of them up against the Asian mainland, which really speaks to the effectiveness of the American submarine campaign by this stage. They were right into the interior waters, including the Sea of Japan, including the LOC and the China Sea. And really there was no escape for Japanese convoys, and especially Japanese convoys with carriers. They were sitting ducks to these wolf packs. Again, another terrible loss of lives inflicted. Then I believe next we come to the big one, 29th of November 1944. The Shinano was a particularly ill-fated ship. On the date of her launch a few months before, she was in a dry dock in Tokyo Bay. As they were retracting the various apparatus from the dry dock to allow the entry of the water from Tokyo Bay, it was discovered rather late that one of the caissons in place had actually not been flooded in the first place. It had been kept in its place by the pressure of the water and the structures on either side of it. When this pressure was released, the Cashin, of course, went straight up at a great rate of knots. The result was that a tremendous volume of water suddenly poured into the dry dock area, and this shunted the Shinano from one end of the dock to the other, causing considerable damage to the bow and stern, injuring quite a number of the dockyard workers and the crew as well. But such was the urgency of the situation that these repairs were commenced immediately. And her commissioning was very limited. Now, such was the secrecy with which this ship had been constructed that no photos of the construction were ever taken. The only photo of her from this perspective that was ever taken was from actually an employee of the shipyard while Shinano was out doing her speed trials. Now, you can see there that she has a slight list to starboard, which gives us at least a perspective. You can see there are no aircraft evident, but you can see a considerable number of crew. And the reason there were a considerable number of people still on board is that the Shinano was essentially incomplete in a number of systems. Most particularly, her watertight doors were not fully installed, the bulkheads had not been fully sealed, and the pumping apparatus and other safety systems had not been fully installed. The Japanese High Command knew about these issues, yet they refused a request from her commander to delay sailing down to Kudo because they were worried that the Americans would have photographs and they would send B-29s to attack the ship while she was still in Tokyo Bay. So on the 28th, she commenced her passage from Tokyo with several destroyers as an escort. Taking the outside route, she encountered the USS Archerfish. And although the submarines originally fended off the Archerfish, the American commander, Joseph Enright, who wrote a book about his experiences tracking down and sinking the Shinano, was able to go on ahead and place himself in a perfect position to intercept the ship on the starboard side if she was zigzagging. And this is precisely what the Shinano was doing. And unfortunately for her, a particular zig or zag put her precisely in the crosshairs of the submarine, which promptly put 4 torpedoes into her side. Now, if we look at the amount of damage inflicted by the torpedo strikes, it was obviously considerable. And in fact, in the case of the boiler rooms, which is 2, 3, and 4, the penetration was made worse by a major crossbeam coming loose and basically punching holes in the bulkheads. Once the ship was listing, counterflooding was tried. However, the absence of the watertight doors and the nil integrity of the bulkhead arrangements meant that the flooding could not be controlled. And it was a tribute really to the size of the ship that it took her over 10 hours to eventually sink. And she may well have not been lost at all had the commander not elected to proceed at full speed at 26 knots for as long as possible, because this action merely increased the rate of flooding. As you can see from her dimensions, she was the largest carrier constructed in the Second World War, albeit from a conversion. She remained the largest aircraft carrier in the world until the commissioning of the USS Forrestal in 1954. And she was intended not as a first-line strike carrier. She was intended as a replenishment carrier. She had a group of her own, about 47, and she could take 50 plus, probably up to about 70 in storage because of the size of her hangars. And the idea being that aircraft would fly from Shinano and replenish the groups of other carriers that were doing the majority of the fighting. Her sinking was followed on the 19th of December by that of the Unryu. And this, in a way, probably summed up the whole sorry story of the capitulation of the Kido Butai. Unryu was in service actually at the time on late, but she could not participate because she did not have any air groups. The two other carriers of her class which were completed, Katsuragi and Amagi, had the same problem. So she was employed as a transport vessel, particularly between Japan and Luzon, which was still in the possession of the Japanese. She departed Japan shortly before the 19th December with destroyer escort with a large and varied cargo, which included a shipment of warheads and Oka for the Oka piloted rocket-powered bombs. These were the bombs that were dropped from Betty bombers or inferior launched off catapults. They were manned and they would be flown into large American ships. Their speed increased via the rocket motors. The warheads were extremely large. The first torpedo did cause damage to the electrical systems. It stopped the ship, but the ship was in no danger of sinking. And while the damage was being repaired, her gun mounts actually took a few pot shots at the submarine and managed to make it submerge. However, it came back for a second go at just on 10 to 5 and put another torpedo into the bow. Now, this time, the torpedo either detonated the warheads first or the fuel tanks, which were still full of aviation gasoline, even though there were none of the Unryu planes on board. Regardless of which went off first, you can imagine what happened next. And in the photo in the top left-hand corner, which is through the periscope, you can see, if you look carefully, the fantail of the port side of the Unryu stern. So what we're looking at basically is the flight deck that is uppermost. As she was sinking, after she had basically lost a considerable portion of her bow, probably back as far as the first gun mount to the explosion. And you can also see through the footage that it was very heavy weather at the time, which assisted in her sinking. The epilogue of the story, as far as the carriers go, was to be found in basically the first few months of March, where they March and July 45, where they were immobilized at home because there was no fuel to run them. And in this instance, the ones that could still be used, very short trips, such as the Ruhio, were used for transport purposes before she was hit by bombs and rockets. Near Formosa, she reached home and they took one look at her and said, "No, good riddance to bad rubbish. You can sit on the mooring." Whereas the Amagi, the Katsuragi, and the other surviving carriers were converted into floating anti-aircraft platforms. And as you can see from the fate of the Amagi, she was targeted a considerable number of times, not just over the period mentioned, but prior as well. And she eventually, with very few casualties, capsized through the effect of her damage, and was left in that state until after the war, along with the Rio and several other carriers. Now, at the end of the war, the Katsuragi and Rio and Hosho were revived, and they were used to transport back to Japan expatriate Japanese, both troops and civilians from all over Southeast Asia. And once they had accomplished these tasks, they were scrapped, and this brought an end to basically the 20th century story of Japan's most feared Kido Butai carrier arm. Now, so far we have looked at the carriers. Now we are going to turn to the things that made them truly dangerous, and that is their air groups. Again, back to January 1942. The Japanese were in possession of the most advanced air groups in the world. If we have a look at their fighter aircraft to start with, we have the A5M Claude, which was going out of service, and the A6M Zero, the very famous A6M Zero, had reached service. Now, the Claude was indicative of Japan's progress in the 1930s. This aircraft entered service in 1937. At the same time, both the United States and the Royal Navy the United States Navy and the Royal Navy were flying biplanes as their chief carrier protection. And as we can see, the Claude was quite an advanced aircraft for its day, fairly good performance. She was designed by the brilliant Japanese designer Jiro Horosaki, whose next creation was the Zero. And the Zero at this time of the war was widely acknowledged, along with the German Focke-Wulf 190, as probably arguably, in fact, more than arguably, but definitely the most formidable fighter aircraft service. Actually, both aircraft were rather similar to each other, both had radial engines. And the Zero, however, unlike the Focke-Wulf, did achieve its amazing performance through a total of absence of armored protection, either for the pilot, the engine, or the fuel tanks. And this was to result in pretty disastrous losses later in the war. As far as the bomber component goes, both the Val and the Kate, the Val dive bomber and the Kate attack plane, were 1930s aircraft, 1938, and they were at least the equal of their American and British counterparts, and certainly superior in the case of the Kate in terms of air performance. These two were first-rate attack aircraft, and both were to achieve very significant victories in the first 6 months of the war. The Val causing no end of trouble to the British in particular, and the Kate responsible for much of the carnage against Battleship Row in the Pearl Harbor attack. Now, during the course of the period January 1 to January 42 to January 44, there were a number of major engagements, and I've listed these up to actually April, at which time there was something of a lull in the Pacific theatre. And as we can see, the first few were pretty one-sided, that being Rabaul, Darwin, and Ceylon. These were engagements for the carrier air groups, I should point out. And then they ran into serious resistance in the form of the Coral Sea, and then Midway, and then the two battles with the carrier battles within the Solomons campaign. Following this was an operation actually that rarely receives the attention it deserves, Operation IGO. And this was a very interesting land-based operation mounted by Admiral Yamamoto to essentially knock out every American and Australian naval and air base within range. And essentially Port Moresby, Milne Bay, and Guadalcanal were the major targets. And it was an offensive designed to forestall any American counteroffensive up through the Solomons after they had secured Guadalcanal. The offensive was conducted with not only land-based air units, but also all of the Kido Butai's carrier air groups. They were transferred to land and made part of the attacking force. To put it bluntly, the result was a colossal failure. The Japanese suffered such heavy casualties with their carrier groups that the carriers could not be operated in formation until the time of the Battle of the Philippine Sea. And the operation itself was, the failure of the operation itself was compounded on the 17th of April, the 18th April 1943, with the shooting down of the aircraft carrying Admiral Yamamoto himself near Bougainville by American long-range P-38 Lightnings, and the assassination was ordered by both Washington and Fleet Commander Pearl Harbor. Now, part of the reason, or in fact, a considerable reason why the Americans were able to gain the ascendancy, or at least parity followed by ascendancy, in the period stated, was that the Wildcat, which was an inferior aircraft to the Zero in terms of close quarter dogfighting, was adapted in a tactical sense to make the best of its attributes and fight the Zeros on relatively even terms by use of two-plane formations. And this was contrived by Commander Thatch, who invented what was known as the Thatch weave, which was basically a system whereby two American fighters would cooperate to get the Zero in a position where it would be basically fleeing from one straight into the gunfire of the other. And fortunately for the Wildcat, while it didn't have the ability of the Zero, it could take an absolute truckload of punishment. And it also had a very heavy armament, which could shred the Zero. And with these two factors in their favour, the American fighter pilots, both in the naval, in the Navy and the Marine Corps, over a very costly period, basically from August to 42 through 1943, learned how to master the Zero in air combat, although they never were able to master it in conditions under which the Japanese were able to dictate the terms of the battle. However, by this point, those were becoming few and far between. Now, if we now turn, however, to the situation in 1st of January 1944, in service for the Japanese, we still have the Zeke, the Val, and the Cape, still in widespread service, especially on the light carriers and with the Zeeks on board the heavy carriers as the fighters. They've been joined at this time by the Judy dive bomber and the Jill torpedo plane. And there are a few notable aspects of these. Firstly, both of these aircraft, in terms of performance, particularly speed, were a considerable advance over the Val and the Cape. Although, and in the case of the Jill, it had advantage in range as well, marginal for the Judy in terms of range. These were both, as aircraft, were both very good aircraft. However, they did suffer a couple of flaws. As you can see in the photo in the top right-hand corner, the Judys were originally constructed with inline engines, supplied under license from Germany, Daimler-Benz, and other varieties. However, these were found, with being unarmoured, were found to be incredibly vulnerable to fire. So in subsequent runs of the Judys, the inline engine was substituted for a radial engine instead. As far as the Jill went, the Jill was actually an excellent aircraft, but one of the problems it suffered was its size. And if you take a careful look at its tail, particularly its rudder, it's actually inclined forward quite markedly. And this was so that it could fit inside the elevators of the carriers that the Japanese had at the time. This would not have been a problem in later carriers because they would have had much wider elevator wells. And the Jill also had a number of troubles with its engine in production. This is one of the reasons it entered service very late, because they just couldn't fix up the problem of the engines. But so once those problems were fixed, it was a considerable improvement over the Cape and a very fine aircraft in its own right. The order of battle for Japan on the eve of the first big engagement, the carrier engagement, obviously being the Philippine Sea, the Japanese could put up 430 planes and approximately 150 land bases. Now, I say approximately 150 because Ozawa was depending on land-based support in the order of some 500 planes. However, the American carrier task force arrived at the area previous to the battle, had given the airfields in Guam and other Tinian and other surrounding areas far north as Okinawa such a working over that there were literally only 150 planes left. And the other problem being is that the runways at Guam, in particular at Rota Field, was so pockmarked with potholes that once you landed, you basically crash landed and take off again. By comparison, the American aerial superiority was overwhelming, principally because of the Grumman F6F. Hellcat, which was America's principal carrier fighter. The F4U Corsair was largely used by the Marine Corps from land bases, and it was the Hellcat that scored the highest toll of Japanese aircraft of any other American aircraft throughout the war. It was a superlative aircraft. It was basically a flying tank, very similar in concept to the Army's P-47 Thunderbolt. It had a tremendous ceiling, good range, and it was extremely heavily armed. In fact, Hellcats, as the war progressed, it became more the practice to use Hellcats in the same role as dive bombers, because they could carry such large bomb loads, and they could carry rockets as well. The second of the new aircraft was the SB-2C Helldiver dive bomber, to replace the much-loved SBD Dauntless. Now, this was considered something of a beast amongst its early crews. It had a lot of stability problems and engine snarls, a number of fatalities in training. However, eventually these problems were ironed out, and it actually turned out to be a very functional military aircraft with, again, with very heavy armament. And it scored a number of significant successes in both the Battle of the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf. The third of them was something of an old stager by 1944, the TBF Avenger, having entered service first in a land-based squadron at the Battle of Midway. And then after the failure of and withdrawal of the devastated torpedo planes from the American carriers after Midway, the Avenger became the standard torpedo plane. And it was a flying tank. It had one of the most reliable aircraft ever constructed. It could take an enormous amount of punishment. And once equipped with a decent torpedo, and this again took time, it was a serious strike weapon. And near the end of the war, it was pretty much up to the stand of the Kates in the early stages of the war, and caused no end of trouble for the Japanese carriers and other warships it came across. The US aerial order of battle on the 19th of June was overwhelming. You can see there, basically one shy of 900, probably may well have been over 900. As you can see from the listings for task groups 58.1 through 58.4, the vast majority of aircraft, back to the point of tripling, doubling the other aircraft, was the Hellcat. And this suited Admiral Spruance down to a T, because he was planning, instead of going out after the Japanese at the Philippine Sea, he was going to let the Japanese come to him, because he did not want to run the risk of going out on a fool's errand out into the sea and out into the wastes of the Philippine Sea, and therefore allowing Ozawa to sneak round his flank and attack the invasion shipping. Essentially, Spruance was not repeating the mistake that Halsey would make at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. This, therefore, gave way to what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a day of absolute carnage in which the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service, the carrier portion of which, was absolutely massacred. You can see the loss ratio was incredible. 350 is a conservative estimate, likely higher than 400. That was including all the land-based aircraft which have been either shot down or shot up. 30 fighters from all causes. It seems on research that the Americans probably lost no more than a dozen fighters in the air-to-air combat. And that just demonstrates the quite staggering superiority of their naval air force at this time of the war. It also demonstrates the fact that the Japanese by this point had basically run out of battle experienced qualified pilots. The Japanese pilots who took part in this battle were all trained. They had all had quite extensive training, but none of them had combat experience, because they were the second cadre. All of the first cadre of Japan, or virtually all of Japan's first cadre, had been killed in frontline service. Now, the difference with this from the American experience was that unlike the Japanese, the Americans would send their experienced aviators back on rotation to flight schools. And with the rotation system, you got a far wider ambit of combat experience. Additionally, new squadrons in the American American carriers were given the opportunity to go to locations still held by the Japanese and the Marshalls and the Carolines and carry out basically live practice against those garrisons. And the disparity in experience between the bulk of the Japanese flyers and the bulk of the American flyers was just overwhelming. And also the fact that the Zero by this point, while still a good aircraft and in the hands of an ace pilot, a very, very good aircraft, was really no match for the Hellcat. The Hellcat was simply too fast. It could pick the terms of the engagement it wanted to fight rather than being lured in by the Zero, and its armament was so heavy that the Zeros were literally exploding left, right, and centre. As I mentioned before, the last rites for the Kido Butai's air groups were staged on the 24th of October, 62 aircraft sent from Ozawa to hit Task Force 38, and it was a complete failure of attack. Only 19 aircraft were lost in what was the last attack mounted by an IJN carrier force in the Second World War. Now, it was a situation for the Japanese really at this stage of the war of too little too late. Because at the climactic moment, they introduced two of the best designs completed by any of the naval powers in the Second World War. The Nakajima Mert, that was NATO, it's, I apologise, US reporting name. The C6N was an outstanding reconnaissance aircraft. It was meant to be deployed aboard carriers, sunk, of course, so it operated only from land bases, and it was virtually impossible for the American fighters, both the Hellcats and the Corsairs, to intercept the Mert at around about 30,000 feet. Extremely fast, very, very good range. Again, delayed because of problems with assembling high-performance engines. And as one can see, it was quite a long aircraft, and if you look at the tailplane, it, like the Jill, was constructed with the smaller carrier, the smaller hangar housings of the current Japanese carriers in mind. The second aircraft, the Aichi Grace, was fortunately for the Allies, never seen in service in anything like significant numbers. It played a minor role in the Okinawa campaign, and the majority of them, like the majority of Japan's best planes, were being held back for the anticipated invasion of the home islands. Now, the Grace was a true beast of an aeroplane. It was fast as a Zero. It had the ceiling of a Hellcat. It had the range of a Zero, a couple of 20mm cannons, and it could carry bombs or torpedoes. It was a quite amazing attack aircraft, and it was also very, very large. And that is one of the reasons why, even if they had reached service in time, the Grace could probably have only been carried by the Shinano and the Taiho. They were the only ships that had the correct dimensions. More than anything else, however, the failure of the Japanese services, the IJNAS, as we've discussed, was caused by the inability of Japan to find a replacement for the Zero. This was it. The A7M SAM, the Reppu, known as hurricane or strong wind in Japanese. The requirements for this aircraft were issued quite soon, actually, after the introduction of the Zero, but they were never afforded the priority they should have been, because the Japanese leadership believed, like the Germans, that their wars would be of such short duration that there was no requirement for such the expenditure of time and resources on such updated designs. The plane, as with the previous two examples, the SAM had major issues with its engine and superchargers. Also, there were structural issues, particularly with flutter, and these took some time to fix. In that time, the project lost priority. So by the time in late 1944, when this aircraft was being produced, at least at a pre-production prototype level, it was simply too late, and which was a major blow for the Japanese, because when this aircraft was tested, it was found to be every bit a match for the latest American planes, if not superior in certain aspects. But because the Zero had basically dominated production lines, it was impossible to even contemplate the delivery of this aircraft in sufficient numbers. And even if they had got them in sufficient numbers, it's likely they all would have been serving from land bases. As it turned out, the fate of the SAM was eventually sealed by the B-29 raids and a rather inopportune earthquake. End of the Second World War, as we can see, there were relics of Japan's most advanced aircraft dotted all over the place. Some of them were taken back to the United States for testing. Some of them even ended up in the bowels of the Smithsonian, where they remain today. And these, of course, were the ones that survived, because the vast majority of the Japanese aircraft were expended in kamikaze attacks. And in the photo, actually, we can see a late model Judy, which has a radial engine. I, as a historian, have mixed feelings over the effectiveness of the kamikaze attacks. I can understand, on the one hand, why the Japanese would have resorted to them, basically with nothing else to fall back on. But as to their utility as beyond a psychological strike weapon, I think that can be questioned, although there is absolutely no doubt that they wreaked absolute havoc on the American fleet. The kamikaze forces did sink 45 ships, most of them light ships, destroyers and the like. And the damage total was 12 fleet carriers, 15 battleships, and 16 light carriers, which is a pretty sizable achievement. But of course, the problem with kamikaze tactics was, once the plane hit the ship, then there was no more plane. And so eventually it was doomed to failure, because you could not marry up the sheer loss of kamikaze planes, or planes dispatched on kamikaze mission, with the output of the factories, which by that point of the war were extremely low in resources and basically at the end of their tether. Now, the central reason the kamikaze was introduced was the destruction of the Kido Butai. Without the Kido Butai, Japan's defences were basically helpless. And once their land-based air assets were destroyed, there was no coming back. And even though the kamikazes played a significant role in giving the Americans a considerable fright before the end of the war, they were unable to avert the final result. And the story of their campaign, and for that matter of the defence of Japan itself against the B-29 raids, is a subject for another day. Thank you very much.